Hello, and today we're going to talk about the end of Andrew Johnson and the start of Radical Reconstruction. So by the end, we'll be able to explain how he was nearly impeached, how that really did cost him his political capital, and how it cost him the election and leads to Ulysses S. Grant taking over. We'll then look at his attempts at Radical Reconstruction, and we'll evaluate the success of these policies and why it failed. So, Andrew Johnson, just to quickly recap, Congress reconvened in 1865. The Republicans and Northern Liberals felt that he'd failed, and it's now a period of congressional reconstruction. Just to run you through it quickly, in May, his reconstruction to December. From 1866, Johnson vetoes, and there's this back and forth between Congress and President Johnson as they each try and establish some form of reconstruction. The 14th Amendment in June 1866, and then in November 1866 we got the midterm gains, where Johnson tries to create his own political party but basically fails. By March 1867 we've got the Reconstruction Act and the Tenure of Office Act that we'll be looking at closely, as well as the suspension of Edwin Stanton in 1867 and the start of the impeachment process. We can see by June 1868 he's acquitted by one vote, and we'll come to that, and then on to the election of Ulysses S. Grant and the beginnings of Radical Reconstruction and its failures. So, after Johnson's obstruction of Congress attempts, they retaliated back. They passed laws to limit his power, and the two examples of this are the Tenure of Office Act that was designed to stop him removing his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and laws prohibiting his power to issue direct military orders, one of the key cornerstones of the powers of the president. In August 1867, Johnson suspends Stanton, and Congress responds straight away by impeaching him as unfit for office. Impeachment is the highest form of censure that they can offer, and it really is a condemnation of Johnson as a leader. In February 1868, Johnson tries to suspend Edward Stanton again, and the House of Representatives, led by Thaddeus Stephen, the radical Republican, attempts to impeach Johnson. After 7 weeks of this back and forth process, the vote fails by one, so Johnson escapes by one vote. He remains president, but his credibility and his effectiveness is destroyed. He will not seek re-election in the coming elections, and it is essentially the end of his presidency, and it begins the new period that we call Radical Reconstruction. So we've had his attempts of presidential reconstruction where he tried to force it through quickly. We've then got Congress's backwards and forwards approach to try and get the 14th Amendment passed, to try and bring about change and reintegration in the southern states, and now we're going to come on to this new approach. Radical Reconstruction, okay, this is the election between Ulysses S. Grant and Seymour. We can see the scale of his win. He wins 3/4 of the states, but when you look closer at this, you actually realise that Seymour was very close. Just 300,000 votes were separating Grant and Seymour. The reality of it is that this victory is really down to the 7 million African Americans that voted for Grant, and that shows to the Democrat Party the extent that the African American vote needs to be tackled or needs to be captured, and it shows the importance of that vote to the Republicans. So, who was Ulysses S. Grant? He was the 18th president, popular war hero. He'd worked closely with Lincoln. He was endorsed by Union veterans. He was widely admired in the North. So on the face of it, he's the perfect candidate. He wins the 1868 election on popularity. He's the man who won the war for the people, not on his policies. He's not somebody that comes in with a clear approach to bringing back the southern states. He supports congressional reconstruction and opposes Johnson, and he wins re-election in 1872. He later becomes associated with scandals that tarnish his reputation and stops him from seeking a third election in 1876, which he was planning on doing. What was Radical Reconstruction? Well, it begins with his election, even though Congress have been planning this for longer. So we could say that actually Ulysses S. Grant didn't have much part to play in the starting of it. By February 1869, the 15th Amendment is passed by Congress. And then we can see his inauguration, where he officially takes over in March. In March 1870, the further year later, it's the ratification of the 15th Amendment. It gains enough votes in Congress and it's passed. We then come to the First, the Second Enforcement Act and the Amnesty Acts. We can see the difficulty that the 15th Amendment has in being enforced because we've got these enforcement acts. September 1873, the stock market crash, the Civil Rights Act in 1875 that we'll look at, and then conservative rulings by the Supreme Court in March 1876. By 1876, the Redeemers, a group that we'll look at, have won back the ex-Confederate states, and it ends really this period that we call Radical Reconstruction. So Radical Reconstruction is made up of the 15th Amendment, the Enforcement Acts, and what comes afterwards with the Civil Rights Act. So what was the 15th Amendment? Radical Republicans wanted to give the votes to blacks because they believed that they would vote for the Republicans. Having Southern African American voters would enable it to keep its power and to keep control over the ex-Confederate states. It was passed in 1869 despite massive amounts of Democratic opposition. The Democrats gained support from the Southerners who feel that the Reconstruction military policy is unconstitutional and fairly punitive. So in order to bring about the 15th Amendment and to ensure that African Americans had the right to vote, it had to rely on the presence of the US Army. It was seen as an army of occupation because federal troops were deployed in these states to ensure that African Americans had the right to vote. So there was opposition, intense, often violent opposition to Radical Reconstruction. Federal government passed 3 enforcement laws in 1870 and 1871. They're often referred to as the Ku Klux Klan laws, as they're in response to the violent outbreaks that the KKK are responsible for. And then we've also got the Civil Rights Act. These are both attempts at bringing about radical reconstruction, bringing the Southerners in line with the Northerners in allowing African Americans to vote. Why do they want to do that? Well, as we've just discussed, it's to allow African Americans to vote for the Republicans to keep them in power. It was proposed in 1870, but it was passed in 1875, 5 years. That shows the scale of intense opposition to these policies. By 1875, support is waning, and it was lucky to be passed at that point. Political opposition from southern state legislatures in this period undermined Radical Reconstruction. The Democrats are fighting viciously back against the Republican majorities. We see the growth in the Redeeming Party, and there's a huge reaction in the South to this. Southern Democrats start a group of Redeemers, and the Redeemers are a group that want to remove the governments that are imposed on them, the forceful government, the forceful control of them by the federal government. And we can see opposition in a number of different ways. We've got the Louisiana 1868 elections. Thousands are killed at these. We've got extensive accounts of electoral fraud. We've got the 1873 Colfax massacre, where 3 white voters and 150 freedmen were killed. September 1874, we've got 5,000 members of the White League. They openly rebel in New Orleans. And it led to the Battle of Liberty Place, where they tried to take back the control of the governor from the Republicans that are held in force by the federal government, and replace it with a Democratic group. By 1876, as we said, Redeemers have won back white Democratic control of most of the southern states. Only Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina remain. So at this point, we see by 1876 that the attempts by Congress and Ulysses S. Grant to bring about change through Radical Reconstruction, through the 15th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act, through the Enforcement Acts, it's failed, or it's failing certainly. And it was partially due to this Southern opposition, but there are other factors at play as well. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was the last piece of legislation of Radical Reconstruction. What undermined it was the corruption and the inefficiency in Republican southern states' governments. So the Republicans themselves in these states may have been able to keep control had they not have been incredibly corrupt. They were using their powers to benefit themselves. There was lots of bribery. Southern states' debts increased, taxes increased, and the Freedmen Bureau was being accused of being corrupt. The result of this was that Southern Democrats were bitterly accused against Republican rule in the South, as it was seen as corrupt and inefficient, and so they really did become unified in their opposition to them. Had they have been less so, moderate Southern Democrats may have not joined this battle. Further factors that undermine Radical Reconstruction are the unfortunate effects on Ulysses S. Grant's presidency. We've got in his first term in charge the fiscal gold scheme, and we've got in his second term the whiskey ring scandal in 1875. Both of these heavily undermine Grant's presidency, and so although he wasn't involved directly, his position is undermined by these two things. The Fisk Gould scheme is also sometimes called the Black Friday scheme as well. Further reasons for failure is the economic situation at the time. So in 1873, we've got an economic depression. Cotton prices fall by 50%, which the South relies on. Railways have stopped being built, and there's many long-established southern industries becoming bankrupt. By 1870, southern income had fallen to less than 2/5 that of the northerners. And this therefore reflects very badly on the Republican governments, and again makes moderate Democrats and moderate Southerners see Reconstruction as the cause for this. Republican governments and expensive enforcement, the federal troops that were necessary, the Freedmen's Bureau that was there, will be blamed for it.